Hey everybody, Pastor James here. Welcome back to our Sunday evening series on the generations that are in our churches these days and in our communities. And we're looking at how to analyze and minister to these different generations effectively. If you'll recall, we've talked about the different generations in churches being like different cultures. And as missionaries, when they go into a new context, examine those cultures and determine ways to minister to those people in those cultures most effectively, that's what we're doing in this series as well. And so I'm excited tonight to be talking with you about a very large group of people, and in fact, the largest generation to date in American history that we are aware of, and that generation is affectionately called the Millennial generation. So tonight, let's talk about the Millennials. Now, here are some, again, some not to be stereotypical, but just to look at some traits of this generation as a cultural group. The Millennials were born between 1982 and 2001. They're also, as I just mentioned, the largest generation in American history, which now numbers over 90 million people. That's a lot of folk. And in fact, specific for West Oak Woods Baptist Church, here in our location in Austin, where our church campus is located, the millennial generation is the largest generation of people living around the church campus and also working here. Now, typically, millennials are viewed by Gen Xers and by baby boomers as a tension. There's a tension between people being full of potential. Gen Xers and baby boomers view millennials as a very powerful group. A lot of potential there to do great things and to change the world. But also, we see other generations view millennials as people who are entitled or have a great sense of entitlement, almost to the point of being narcissistic. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more in just a moment about that. I don't know if that's a very fair allegation to level on millennial people, and most anybody for that matter. But we're going to look at that here in just a minute about what that really means in terms of church ministry. Now, deeply impactful events that occurred in this generation so far. We've seen most notably September 11th, a cataclysmic world-changing event, 9/11. And of course, some of the millennial people in that generation don't remember 9/11 because they were too young. However, it doesn't mean that event didn't have resounding effects on them and on the whole world. So obviously 9/11 was a big deal. Also, we saw the Middle Eastern wars really take off starting in 2003 when the invasion of Iraq happened, and then all of the both the militaristic and also political fallout that occurred from those experiences and those wars. This generation also saw the election of the first African American president in American history. The Obama presidency was deeply impactful for millennials. And also, I don't even know if we should say it, but because it's just become so basic in our culture today, but the internet really came to life, obviously, during the millennial generation. And so what we have now is a generation who is very adept with technology, and the internet is just a part of life. And there's not really a recollection of life before the internet. And so that has become just part and parcel of existence on a daily basis. There's some core values also that millennials tend to address highly and value a great deal. One of those is called multiculturalism. Now, there are a lot of definitions of what multiculturalism is, but essentially for this video series and what we're talking about here, Multiculturalism is just in its very logical, common sense definition. Millennials value a lot of voices, a lot of nationalities, a lot of people of different races and ethnicities and sexual orientation, that sort of thing. A multicultural environment. We see the millennial generation embrace that perhaps more than any generation before them, and certainly of the past 150 years. We've also seen the millennials value what's called tolerance. Now, that word also has been used to such a degree that perhaps it's lost its true meaning. But basically, what we're talking about with tolerance is an acceptance of diverse moral standards. The idea that there really is no one standard of morality, but there are a whole lot of standards, and it just kind of depends on your preference as to which standard that you go with. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment and the effect of that mindset and that value on the church. Also, the millennials tend to value or tend to focus on what we would call the micro and less on the macro. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, we see millennials focus a lot more on the local, what's happening right around me in my community, among my neighbors, my family group, my tribe. And so you'll see, of course, an emphasis or an interest in things that are going on in the world, but also you see more of an interest on what is happening in my immediate surroundings. So it's a focus more on the micro than on the macro. All right, let's talk just a minute then about technology and millennials. We mentioned just a moment ago that the internet is quite a big deal to this generation. It's just a part and parcel of life. But technology, in the sense of computerization and the information age, is seen as both omnipotent and omnipresent, which can be very dangerous in terms of idolatry. But just speaking in terms of reality, the way that life is right now, this is how technology is viewed. That there's almost a limitless potential to its promise and power, and that it's always around. In fact, I'll just show you this right here. Here's a picture of my phone. I've got an iPhone 8. And of course, I'm behind the times, right? And this is just like a 3-year-old phone. But the sense is that this is always on. It's always connected, and it's basically attached, right? So that's how technology is these days. And there's some dangers that come in that, and a real tension that's in there. In fact, among millennials, we see a tension between what we call doing nothing and between that and taking on vast amounts of responsibility. In other words, we're so connected that we become overwhelmed with information and have a sense of either, man, I can't do anything about this. There's nothing I can do in the world, so I'm just going to isolate myself and do the best I can. Or we have so much information that we want to take on so much responsibility that we can get burned out. So that's one of the problems that we're seeing with technology and the millennial generation. Now, other generations may view millennials as selfish or entitled. So let's talk about that for just a moment. What other generations see as selfish in millennials, we see among millennials that they don't see themselves as selfish or entitled, but they see themselves as balanced. In other words, some generations, especially in the church, older generations, may view millennials as they don't like the church, they don't want to be involved in the church, they don't have time for the church, and they're more invested in other things. Well, millennials would see this as being balanced. I want more time with my family, they would say, or I want more time for this sort of leisure activity. And so I'm just going to carve out maybe an hour here, an hour there to devote to spiritual life and to congregational life, if they're involved in a church whatsoever. But they would view that not as being selfish, but as being trying to live a more balanced life. And I can see the argument there for sure. But we'll talk more about how the church can approach that sort of attitude and adjust to that here in just a moment. But what about this idea of being entitled? You may hear that all the time. I see it on the news, different journal articles that I read, some things like that say, well, all these millennials, they're just entitled. Well, I think all of us, from a human nature standpoint, because of sin, certainly see ourselves as entitled, but we should beware of putting that as a pejorative term on just one segment of the human population. To call somebody entitled is sort of a vague accusation. What do you really mean by that? Perhaps we should do better by not saying millennials are entitled, because there's a sense where everybody's entitled or expresses that sense of entitlement. But we should probably substitute the word entitled with the word expectant. Millennials are an expectant people. They expect certain things to be in place in the workplace, in the home, in the church, in their family, in their vocation. They're very expectant people. In fact, that has been my experience with many millennials over the years. I haven't gotten a sense that they feel entitled in the sense of it's my way or the highway, but more of a sense of expecting certain things to be there. Now, some people in older generations blame millennials for that kind of expectation. You can't expect things to be your way all the time. And there's an aspect of truth in that. But also we have to understand that baby boomers and Gen Xers who brought millennials into the world, right? We set very high bars for what they should expect. And so part of this sense of entitlement or expectation that we oftentimes criticize in millennials, we ought to, instead of pointing the finger at them, look at how we raise them and the environments in which we raise them. They are expectant people, an expectant generation, and desire for things to be a certain way. That's not necessarily a sense of entitlement or comes from that, but it comes from a sense of expectation in how millennials were raised. Also, among this generation, another core value is this, that truth is viewed as relative and intensely personal. In other words, your truth is your truth and what you believe, and I'll have my truth, and somehow we'll tolerate each other and just get along. So in the millennial generation, we've seen a real rejection of what we call objective truth. Truth has become more subjective. There's been a real embrace of what was really pre-Enlightenment philosophy and thought. And it's actually has a fancy word these days. It's called postmodernism. It's a sense that what you think is right, you do that, and I'll do what I think is right, and we'll just keep that to ourselves and be individualistic and personal about it. And whenever there's conflict about those ideas, we'll just do our best to get along. Now, as you can probably sense from just merely saying that there's some inherent danger and some inherent conflict in that core value. So we'll talk about that here again in just a moment. So what about the church? What about the church? How can organized churches embrace, value, minister to, and minister with millennials? Well, here's some things to keep in mind. First of all, we're seeing a tendency in millennial generation towards what we call tribalism, with seemingly unending choices. In other words, you have a tribe of people that are really focused on this social work or social activity, and I'm going to invest my time in racial equality and in that particular group, and then I'm going to shift over here to equity in the workplace. And you see these, it's almost a buffet line of different social activities that millennials would actually call kingdom work or kingdom of God work. And there's a tendency to get involved in one specific tribe for a set amount of time and then move on to another issue, usually a social issue, to dive in there. So the question for churches at this point is, what are we connecting in practice to our theology? In other words, millennials are not going to be very keen on just coming to a Bible study or hearing a lecture on a Sunday morning without any meat on the bones. They're going to want to be able to do something. So in our churches today, we need to be focusing on what kind of activity application connects to the information that they're being given. Also, churches need to be aware of the tendency of technology and social media to ironically lead millennials to a more increased sense of isolation. That sounds ironic, but it's true that the more we see some of the millennials dive into social media, that the more isolated they feel. So how can we in the church help millennials with their sense of isolation and the anxiety that comes from that? And this may sound also ironic to say, but the church can provide more personal interactions rather than social media interactions. Could it be that the church could focus more on interaction at a personal level than just working through these all the time? Maybe. Also, we've seen conflict in the church, especially between baby boomers and millennials, for their supposed lack of commitment. I've heard this a lot as a Gen X pastor over the years and trying to mediate some of that conflict. Some of the older generations will look at young people and say, well, they just don't want to do anything. They never show up. They don't do this and they don't do that. Well, it could be, again, that millennials are looking for a balance in their life, and that comes across, however, to many older generations as a lack of commitment. So how can we better understand the commitment level, not only of baby boomers, but also of millennials, and find a good balance in that tension? Also, churches today must be open to how we deal with rejection from millennials of the church in total. In other words, what we're seeing today is a very marked increase in the number of millennials who totally reject organized faith, organized religion, and reject the church at large. In fact, the highest number of respondents to recent surveys among millennials about whether or not they participate in an organized religion, that being a Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, anything. Most millennials today are saying they don't have any preference. We call them the nones, actually, N-O-N-E-S. Do you have a religious preference? I have none, is the response. So the church today needs to deal with this rejection. What is causing this rejection? And also, how do we deal with a sense of rejection when millennials say, we really don't want anything to do with the church? It's not personal. We just want to go our own way. How do churches deal with that? Also, churches today need to be more open to what we would call difficult subjects or difficult questions and discussions. Millennials seem to be primed for having conversation about things that in previous generations may have seemed off-putting, or, those are things we just don't talk about around here. So millennials seem to have more of an openness to things like sexuality, conversations about what that means, faith from the perspective of who God really is, and some aspects of God's being and God's character that some millennials call into question. Churches need to be open to those discussions and to have more open conversations about what it truly means to be a Christian and to be a believer in this new day and time that we're living in. Also, churches would do well to emphasize local missions. Millennials are particularly engaged at a local level these days. So how can the church be more involved locally, not to negate or exclude things that are happening nationally and internationally, but how can we engage millennials at a local level in terms of serving our neighbors? Also, churches focusing on discipleship and particularly focusing on discipleship at a closer level, developing community out of 3 or 4 people instead of having a room full of 20, 25, or 100 who are doing the same thing. Millennials seem to be focused on discipleship at a very micro level. So this is actually very good if you think about it from a not a political perspective, a biblical and theological perspective. Jesus ministered to his inner circle, those apostles. He just took aside 12, right? And then out of those 12, selected 3 to really invest his time in. That kind of model could really work well in terms of discipleship with millennials. And then also, theological depth seems to be more important to millennials than numbers. Where in previous generations, you've seen church life focus on how many people came this week, how many baptisms did we have this month, how many people gave a tithe and an offering this month. Those numbers are important for sure. But we're also seeing among millennials a tendency to say, well, what are you really talking about? You may have 300 people here, or 1,000 people, or 2,000 or 10,000 in church, but what are they there for? What's the idea? What's the main point? And so churches can do a better job in reaching millennials by talking about the point. Focus more on the why that we're here than the fact that we just want to get a whole bunch of people in the room together. Now, next week, we're going to talk about some conclusions to this series as we've talked about ministry to and with and for baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials. We're going to put kind of a wrapping bow on this next Sunday. So I hope that you join us as we conclude this series, and I hope that this has been productive and informative and helpful to you as we continue to talk about ministry, effective ministry to the generations. So until then, we'll see you soon. Hope you have a great week, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.